One of the things that I find really interesting is how we can all experience within the same place, the same time, the same thing, and we can walk away with radically different perspectives of that thing that we experienced. Think about church, for instance, or going to a restaurant or a place or whatever it might be, right? I think about this with symbols. It's a very notable example of this. With various symbols that we see, we all experience something different based on our worldview, our background, our belief system. Take the symbol of Starbucks, for instance. For some of you in here, when you see this symbol, you are like, that is the holy grail of coffee. For others of us in here, when we see this, we think of burnt coffee. Are there any burnt coffee people in here that you would say you're a coffee snob and you're like, Starbucks is not? Okay, there's 3 of us in here. That's great. Okay, there's more of you honest people. You're like, I don't know if I wanted to be honest. For some of us, it's burnt coffee. It's fine, whatever. I call those like fluffy drinks frappa yo-yo drinks, but I don't think it's real coffee. Maybe for you see this sign right here, and it gives you hope and joy and excitement for a good weekend. For some of us in here, we're like, nope, I don't know what I need, where to go, where to find it, who to talk to. I've already gone to YouTube. I don't know what to do. Maybe Home Depot is one of those for you. I think a more controversial one is this one right here. And I say this because for some, this is a symbol of joy and happiness and peace in the world. For others, men, guys, lean in here, okay? This is a symbol of hardship and suffering and marital strife, right? I saw a YouTube video once that showed that there was this support group for guys in the Target parking lot while their wives were inside the Target shopping, and it was a support group for one another, which I just thought was amazing. Maybe for you have different perspectives when you see this. We don't really know what this is yet, right? Because this is the new Twitter logo, but I don't know if we're supposed to call it Twitter or if it's called X or what. I'm not caught up on exactly where that is, but Elon Musk has a good idea, so we'll go with him. And finally, this one, you get the point, but here's one more for fun. Is the hook 'em sign. Now, there's a story with this because about 10 years ago, I went to Juja, Kenya with our Mosaic team. We were partnered with a church and an orphanage that's on the property of the church in Juja, Kenya, and we go and visit once a year. And I went there, and we're taking pictures with the kids, and we're hanging out, and of course, we're wearing our UT stuff. We're throwing up hook 'em signs, and they're giving us weird looks. And we're kind of like, what's going on here? And then finally, one of them pulls us to the side to tell us that this in Kenya is a sign of the devil. So we were pretty surprised because we'd just been like, woo, 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 like all of our photos that we were taking. And so, of course, we're like, okay, well, that's helpful information to know. A different perspective of the exact same thing. If you are an Aggie or Sooner here, you're probably like, I can relate with the Kenyans, right? These are the Kenyan people in the room. But we all see these symbols differently, but I would say at their core, they do represent objective, specific things. Starbucks is coffee, as much as I would not like to say it, is coffee. Target is a store, right? Like they represent these things. There is one symbol that is, by just a lot of research, the most recognizable symbol in the world. It is one that elicits a lot of different responses, a lot of different feelings and emotions. You might have guessed what it is because it is the cross of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the cross is such an interesting symbol. For a lot of us in here, we probably think of different things. We feel different things when we see this. Maybe for you, it's a symbol of your faith, of your relationship with God. Maybe for you, it's a symbol of hope or joy or all that is good in the world. For some of us, it's just an irrelevant religious icon. For some of us in here, it's just a symbol that we're like, I don't know, based on my bad church experience, I have questions when I see a cross. I'm not quite sure what I think about that. The symbol of the cross has really changed over time in terms of what it meant to individuals. When we go back 2,000 years to the first century, it was a symbol of pain and suffering. Oftentimes we see crosses depicted in Hollywood or illustrations as if they are like 15 or 20 feet in the air, and that's where people were. But in reality, a Roman cross used to execute somebody. They would put it about maybe 8 feet tall, just like this one right here, which means the Romans wanted people, public, to be able to come up to somebody who was being crucified on a cross, and they wanted people to be able to hear it, to smell it, to experience the horrific nature of what was happening. Because the Romans wanted to communicate through this symbol what would happen to you if you got out of line with Rome. And that's what this symbol meant all those years ago. And then fast forward a couple hundred years, in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted from paganism to Christianity, and it began the journey of the cross being what it is today, the symbol of Christianity. While we all have a different perspective, we all have a different feeling or thought when we see this symbol, I would argue that it does, at its core, represent something very objective. That the cross of Jesus actually represents this idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness. We've been in a series the past few weeks called Those People, talking about those people in our life that we all have, and sometimes those people are the ones who have hurt us, who have wronged us, who have done something in our lives that has forever left a mark on our story. The problem with those people, and the reason we've done an entire series on this, is because those people in our lives can gain a measure of control over our life. That if we are not careful, we can inadvertently, subconsciously hand the keys of our emotional, our mental, our relational well-being to somebody else. I think this happens to a great degree when it comes to being one of those people who have hurt us or wronged us. Because it could be somebody that's just was a part of our story that we didn't know they were a stranger, but what they did forever left its mark on our life. Or it could be somebody who was supposed to be our people. They were supposed to be somebody who should have loved us, been in our corner, our family, our friends, our community, but because of what they did, they became one of those people to us. Because they did something that created a gap in our life. It created a chapter of our story that we never chose in the first place. It left us reeling emotionally, trying to pick up the pieces of whatever that thing was. It left us losing sleep at night, having conversations in our head. It's like it's almost they have a measure of control over us when we're not careful because they are one of those people. As you can imagine with the nature of this topic, for some of us in here, this is a very heavy topic, and I just want to give a heads up about that. For me, in my story, personally, it's a very personal one because of an experience I had a couple of years ago where I've experienced just a very significant wounding in some of my closest relationships. When this happened, it left me kind of reeling, trying to pick up the broken pieces of these different parts of my life that were a really big deal. But because of what I experienced, I went to God and I invited God into it. And just in my faith journey, I felt a very clear calling just to stay right where I was and deal with it. Everything in me wanted to run and get away, but I just felt like I had to stay right where I was. And so that's what I did. But what I found was not so encouraging, because by staying where I was, I began to experience these really negative emotions in me. This anger, this bitterness, this resentment began to build and grow and grow and grow and grow, and it began to kind of rob my joy and my happiness in my life. And no matter how much I knew I should forgive, I mean, I was a follower of Jesus. I knew the story of the cross. I knew all this. But no matter how much I knew I should forgive, I just felt stuck. And these negative emotions, they wouldn't go away, and I didn't know what to do with them. One of the things that our lead pastor, Buck Evilhouse, says often when you are stuck is that you just need new information to help you get unstuck. And it was when there was a resource put in front of me that I got this new information that a light bulb came off. Because this resource talked about this word, this phrase, that I had never really thought of it this way before. And it was this thing called unforgiveness. Now that seems pretty intuitive, right? But it was unpacked like this. Unforgiveness is not between us and another person. Unforgiveness is something that happens in us, grows in us as a result of what happened to us. It's like that old saying that says to not forgive somebody over time is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. That's unforgiveness. It can be defined like this. It is delayed negative emotions involving resentment, bitterness, hostility, hatred, residual anger, and residual fear. That word delayed there is really important because you are not hurt or wounded by somebody else and experience unforgiveness. There's a sadness, there's a pain, there's an anger that goes with it. But over time, as you go back to and you chew on and you ruminate over and over and over again, it's like this thing begins to grow inside of you. And it's kind of like a Trojan horse. And I say Trojan horse because it looks good on the outside and it makes its way into your life and your heart. And it looks good on the outside because it is justified. that what they did was wrong. They should not have done that. You are right in your anger and your emotions and your feelings and all of that stuff. What they did was not okay, but this Trojan horse makes its way into our life, and within it is this thing called unforgiveness that can do a lot of damage to our lives. I want to read a few examples of what unforgiveness can look like. Unforgiveness can be when we find ourselves exploding on people around us, maybe for little things, but we see red and we really can't control it. And because of this, it robs the security of our relationships, and people walk around on eggshells around us, and we don't know where that comes from. Unforgiveness can be when we find ourselves having conversations in our head with people who hurt us. It can be present when a text message or a call or the mere presence of somebody or bumping into someone can just leave us reeling emotionally, our day ruined because of it. We can experience unforgiveness when we define ourselves more on something that has happened in our past than who we are today. And we allow that to guide how we treat each other, how we treat people in our life. This is called victimization, where we kind of live this life in a kind of woe is me mentality. We play the blame game. All of my problems are everybody else's fault. Unforgiveness can rear its head when normal things in our life, like a song or a car, can trigger us into an emotional spiral that we struggle to get out of. Unforgiveness can happen when we say we struggle to trust people because of something that has happened, that they did to us or another individual did to us. And because of this, we're lonely because we fear relationships. We fear intimacy. One of the more prevalent ones is just when we find ourselves repeating generational cycles of hurt and pain, where what happened in our past starts to show up in our present. Where we might have said or thought to ourselves at one point, my mom did this, my dad did this, I will never be like them. But then we go through life and we discover that hurt people, and when you don't deal with it, what's in you comes out of you on those around you, and it's like over time you begin to realize that the very things that they did to you that hurt you, you start to do to those that you love the most. This is the effect of unforgiveness. It is sneaky, it is deadly, it can lurk beneath the surface of our lives and our hearts for months or years or even decades. And the reason it's the primary reason why those people can get control is because unforgiveness leaves you with just this bitterness, this cynicism in life, this anger. It robs your joy and your happiness. It robs your relationships with other people. It robs your relationships even with your Heavenly Father. Because you can do all the right faith things and you can check the boxes and you can give and get in a group and do all these amazing things, which are amazing. But at some point you get to this kind of wall and you keep bumping up into it. And you don't know why you can't seem to grow closer to God. And perhaps you're at that point in unforgiveness where it's time to go back in order to be able to go forward in your faith. This is unforgiveness. And when I read this and I learned about this for the first time, it described what I had experienced. It described my story, what I felt stuck with, and I desired everything in me to break free from that. And maybe as you hear that, you can see yourself in that. Maybe you can see your own journey with unforgiveness. Perhaps you've never been given it a word or a phrase, but perhaps you've been stuck with negative emotion at some point. Or perhaps you've tried to forgive, but you still feel like that grudge, that anger is holding on to you. And when it comes to holding grudges, if we're honest, I think grudges feel great, right? Feels good to get a glass of wine or go grab a beer with a friend and just vent and talk about how frustrated we are and all that. And we're like, man, that feels good. But what that tends to do is it just grows this thing in us, and it grows and it grows. And we picture the grudge where we're telling that person off and there's a crowd of people around us and they're cheering us on and we say all the right things, right? And we have this image in our mind of this. Maybe it's like that, this is very dramatic, but maybe it's like that Hollywood movie, 300, where he Spartan kicks him, right? That is dramatic. Nobody responded. So yes, that is not at all. But these grudges, these things, I think if we're honest, they're not working, are they? They're hurting us more than it involves the other person. If we're honest, it feels like the grudge, the anger, the resentment that we're holding on to feels like it's holding on to us far tighter than we would like. I don't want that for us. I don't want that for myself. I desire for us to be able to break free from the grip that unforgiveness has on our lives. And what we've been asking, the question we've been asking throughout this series, is this question of, what do we do with those people? What do we do with the ones who have hurt us, who have wronged us, and because of that, it will forever be a part of our story? How do we forgive? What does forgiveness even look like? How do we go about experiencing a true forgiveness and getting unstuck from unforgiveness? These are the questions we're going to explore in our short time together today. And what's interesting about these questions we have about forgiveness is they are not unique to us. I think these are human nature things, because when you read the Gospels and you look at Jesus' ethic of love and the way he treated people, he was asked questions about forgiveness as well. And there's this one specific instance that when you kind of zoom out of it, I find it a little comical in picturing it, because there's this one instance where one of the disciples, Peter, goes up and asks Jesus a question. And it's almost like they'd all been hanging out and talking to one another, and one of them had this thing that a friend did, and they're like, what do I do? Like, forgive. Well, what about, what if, kind of like we do, right? And then Peter, who's just this feeler, he's just like bold, and you read the Gospels, and he always just goes after it, right? And it's like he says, you know what, I'm just going to go ask Jesus about it. I'm going to go for it, okay, here we go. And so he goes to Jesus, and here's what he says. He says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, 7 was an important number because there was a consensus among the first century rabbis that you are to forgive somebody for the same events up to 3 times. But Peter, he's done this with Jesus, and he thinks he's got it right, and then Jesus is like, nope, you missed it. And so I'd imagine this time around he's going, you know what? Jesus goes above and beyond in everything. It's a consensus that it's 3. I'm going to go with 7. I'm going to go with 7. So Jesus, I got you on this one. Is it 7 times, right, Jesus? And then look how Jesus responds. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, which I think Peter is probably just like, gosh dang it, like I thought I had him one time, right? He says 77 times. It's kind of not a literal number, but more of a hyperbolic nature of forgiveness that Jesus was all about. And the disciples don't fully understand this, as oftentimes we don't either. And so Jesus launches into a parable to explain his nature of forgiveness and how he views forgiveness. A parable is a made-up story to make a point. And here's what he begins to share. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. So there's this man indebted to this master, and he's got 10,000 bags of gold, which doesn't mean a lot to us today, but if you were to kind of convert it to today's dollars, what the disciples would hear would be something along the lines of $11.9 billion of debt. Now that's a lot of debt. In fact, I don't even know how creative you have to get in order to get into that amount of debt. Like, that sounds difficult to do, right? But this is the debt this man has, and his master is settling accounts. And the disciples go, there's no way this man can pay it back. It's an incomprehensible amount. And it says, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Now, this was a pretty common practice in first century times. It sounds brutal, but oftentimes when you couldn't pay a debt back, you or your property, your family would be sold into slavery as a sense of kind of punishment for it. And of course, he doesn't want this. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. But it's 11.9 billion. Another translation equivalent to that too, based on the salary of a servant, about 100,000 years worth of labor. So there's no way he can pay it back. But he says, be patient with me. And what does the master do? Then his master was filled with pity for him. And he released him and forgave his debt. That phrase, filled with pity, in another translation, says filled with compassion for him. And then just like that, $11.9 billion canceled, forgiven, which the disciples would have heard this and just thought, oh my gosh, what mercy, what forgiveness, right? But Jesus is not done telling the parable, and he continues. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Now, 100 silver coins would have been equivalent to around $8,700. And that's a good chunk of money. It's about 100 days worth of wages back in this time period. So he just got 11.9 billion canceled, and he got out, and he finds this guy who owes him 8,700. You'd think he would have some grace, some mercy, but look at this. It says, he grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back," what he had just said to his master who canceled his debt. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. He does the opposite of what was just done for him. Then word makes it back to the master. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened, which is not good for him considering the good news that he had just received. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I canceled all that debt of yours. I forgave all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" But no. It says in his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. And then Jesus gives this kind of summary statement of the entire parable, the point that he is trying to make with this story. He says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." And this is a really big statement. And the disciples had asked the question about how often to forgive, and they're given an answer that is just far bigger in scope than answering just how often they forgive, because Jesus is saying, you've minimized it to the point of what's the least amount of work I can do in order to forgive, and you're missing the point of forgiveness, is what Jesus is portraying here to the disciples. Because forgiveness is far less about us and the other person as it is about us and our Heavenly Father. Because in this parable, Jesus equates of our sin to God to about $11.9 billion. That we are the first servant in the parable. God is the master. And you see, in our lives, throughout our stories, we live outside of God's design. That is called sin. And what happens, because God is perfect and infinite and good, when we live outside of his design through our free will, because he loves us, it creates a gap. It creates a debt. Every lie, every moment of greed, the debt gets bigger and bigger. And then Jesus, he sets the bar even higher. And he says, if you even look at another person with lust, you've already committed adultery in your heart. If you even look at another person with anger, you've already committed murder in your heart. And the debt just grows and grows, and the gap grows and grows and grows. And Jesus says it's about $11.9 billion of debt, our sin against God, an incomprehensible amount that no amount of good could add up to cancel out. But God, in his compassion, God sent Jesus to live a perfect life, to die a death that he did not deserve because he did not sin. He lived without sin. And in doing so, it was the one thing that canceled the debt, satisfied the justice of God. And that is why I say that at its core, the cross is a symbol of forgiveness, because it's a symbol of our debt being canceled, our debt being forgiven between us and God. And then Jesus says, their sin against us, he equates to about $8,700. Now, that is a big amount. If somebody owes us that amount of money, we will do everything we can probably to get that back, right? It was important that Jesus didn't say $5 or $10. He didn't want to minimize the things in our life that happened to us. But the point he is trying to make is how minuscule the amount is that is owed to us in comparison to the debt that we owed to God. And he's saying, yes, they did something that created a debt. They did something that took moments of your life you'll never get back. They did something that took a childhood that you'll never have. It created a family dynamic that you'll never get. It created a distrust in relationships and intimacy with other people. That is true. They did that. There is a debt owed. But don't forget your debt to God and what God did to cancel the debt and forgive you. What he's saying is that the foundation of our ability to forgive is in our own forgiveness. That the way forward in us choosing to forgive somebody is found in the fact that we are first forgiven. That at the cross of Jesus, every question, every pushback, every what about is answered. It is addressed. Because when we put ourselves at that moment in history and we see him hanging there for us and we see a drop of blood for our sin and the ways we fall short, it enables us to cancel the debt of somebody else. I don't think forgiveness makes sense without this. I would say, this is just my opinion, that forgiveness is arbitrary apart from the cross of Christ. It's arbitrary. It just doesn't make sense because if there is no God and the story of Jesus is not true, well, then we can take a more nihilistic perspective and we can say, well, we are just all piles of matter then. And when we hurt somebody or someone hurts us, it's just one pile of matter hurting another pile of matter, and it really doesn't matter. And we should just cut ties and move on with our life and do our best to be happy. But if God is real, and the story of Jesus is true, and he is who he claimed to be, well, then that means that my massive sin debt was canceled, that your massive sin debt was canceled, and those people, their massive sin debt was canceled as well. It is all addressed at the cross of Jesus. And all of this, the one thing I would just want all of us to walk out of here with, and really the answer to the question of what do we do with those people, is this foundational point. Forgiven people, forgive those people. Forgiven people, forgive those people. The way forward, again, is your own forgiveness at the cross of Jesus. In my own story, in my journey, I mentioned that season of my life where I was stuck, where I experienced unforgiveness. I knew this to be true. I work for a church, follower of Jesus. I should be a professional at forgiving people. But I just had this grip of unforgiveness in my life that I could not shake. And no matter how much I knew the story of the cross to be true in my life, something was stuck. I was missing a component of this. And again, it wasn't until this resource was put in front of me that kind of freed me. It was a light bulb. It opened it up for me to understand it to a greater degree that I had not up until this point. It was a book written by a man named Everett Worthington. And I always love the titles that are good, like 80s and 90s counseling books, right? But Everett Worthington, he's got an interesting story. He studied forgiveness for a career, for decades. He taught about it. And then one night he got a phone call that his mom was murdered in her home by a robber. And he describes going to the scene and experiencing all of it and everything that came as a result of that. And then over the next couple of months, he began to experience unforgiveness. Unforgiveness for the perpetrator who was actually never caught. And he talks about how it began to rob his joy, his happiness, the relationships in his life. And as he unpacks this, what he does is he kind of goes through his own forgiveness journey, and he breaks it up into these three categories that for me were so helpful to understand, so illuminating for me in what I was wrestling with. He first described this first category like this, he called it decisional forgiveness, where we cancel the debt that is owed to us, and we agree to control our negative behavior toward the other person. It's just a mind thing. It's a behavior decision to go, they don't owe me anymore, I choose to forgive. And then he brought up a second category that I had yet to hear of, emotional forgiveness. The negative emotions that we are still left with, even after decisional forgiveness, are replaced with positive emotions. So all of that bitterness, all of that anger is replaced with joy and compassion and love and peace. And then he gives a third category and says reconciliation. He defines it like this: reestablishing trust in a relationship after trust has been violated. Now this one, you could do an entire message just on this last category right here. That's not the point of today, but I just do want to say one thing about this. When it comes to forgiveness, decisional and emotional, that is something that happens with us only. That it just takes one person. It is our decision, our journey to do that. Reconciliation takes two people from a healthy posture with intentionality, leaning into a relationship to rebuild trust either to a certain extent or to the point that it once was before. Sometimes, in the case of Everett Worthington, reconciliation is just not possible. And I just want to throw that out there because that's a really important thing to keep in mind here. But when it comes to forgiveness, it's all about us. It's all about our own unforgiveness. And when I saw these two categories, what I realized in my mind is I had done a lot to try to decide to forgive. I knew the cross of Jesus. I knew it all. I was a follower of Jesus. I believed this wholeheartedly. But I had missed a key part of it, this idea of emotional forgiveness. I still had all these negative things. I still had this unforgiveness. I missed the part in the passage of Matthew that we just read where Jesus says this again, where he says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister," there it is, "from your heart." I'd experienced it in my mind. I had yet to experience it here. And so when I read this, luckily for my wife and I, Ashley and I, we were about to go on a trip to Colorado just to get away and get some rest. And I was reading this book at the time, and I decided, okay, I'm gonna take this trip, and I'm gonna spend this time just leaning in and diving into everything in here about emotional forgiveness. I desired to break free. I wanted to break free. I wanted to see things differently. And so we got to Colorado, and I'd finished the book, and I went to the part where it talks about the different steps of emotional forgiveness. And what I did is we were staying in a house, and there was a creek nearby with a bench near the creek. And so I went to that bench for 3 or 4 hours a day for the next 3 or 4 days straight with my iPad and my journal, and I just began to write down page after page after page of these steps. And I just invited God into this whole process where Worthington says, recall what had happened, and then recall what had happened from the perspective of the person who hurt you, and then try to name reasons as to why they would do that thing to you, which was very difficult to do. And then write down statements of empathy as you're understanding what they did to try to get to a point where you forgive altruistically for the benefit of the other person. And this was wild for me because sitting there and writing these things down, I didn't know this would happen, but I came to the realization that what had been done to me, I had that in me. I was very capable of doing that to other people. And I came to that realization, and something began to change in me, but I got to the step where it said you have to create a symbol of forgiveness. I hadn't done this yet. I had decided to forgive, but I hadn't created kind of a marker moment in my life. And so what I did, we were planning on going on a big hike the next day. We were hiking this mountain called Gray's Peak. And I decided that I would take a stone from the house, stone because of another passage where Jesus says, "You who are without the first stone, or you who are without sin, throw the first stone." And so in my own brokenness, I grabbed a stone, I put it in my backpack. We drove to the trailhead the next morning, and we started the hike. It was, 5 or 6 miles up to the top of the mountain. And we get up to the top of the mountain, and I look around and I just see the immense beauty and glory of God around me, standing on this peak and seeing all these other mountains and just a perspective that feels like you're in a plane. It was just absolutely beautiful. And then I was also reminded of this moment in history. I was reminded of when Jesus hung for me, the drops of blood that were shed for me. And just prayerfully, I took out my stone and I put it down as my symbol of deciding not to throw my stone, as my symbol of just deciding to forgive. And I took a picture of it. And this is my stone on top of Gray's Peak. It's the one in the middle. I'd like to say it's one of the bigger ones, but it's the one in the middle. And I prayed over this spot. And I kind of had a cynicism to this whole idea in the first place where I was like, putting down a rock is not going to do anything for me. But it turned out to be a very powerful and emotional moment. I didn't know it then, but it would begin to turn things around for me. It served as a symbol of my path really changing. I took a picture of it, as you can see, and I put it as the background on my phone. And over the next couple of months, every time I felt one of those negative emotions, I would open up my phone and I'd look at that and I'd see my reminder, my symbol of a decision to forgive. And it was like, as I did this over and over again, trying to hold on to this forgiveness, literally neural pathways being rewritten in my brain, it was like all of a sudden I felt these negative emotions begin to diminish. And I began to experience a forgiveness from the heart, to the point where I can stand up here today in a further understanding of what this moment in history means for me, a deeper understanding and gratitude and humility for this moment in my relationship with God. And I can stand up here, and I'm far from perfect, and I still look back on that season with sadness, but I can know that I'm free from the grip that unforgiveness had in me. In fact, it was so powerful just this whole season that when we were pregnant with our first son, my wife just said, when we found out it was a boy, she just said, which was like it just made me feel so good as a dad. She said, "You name your firstborn son," which I was like, I'm going to name my firstborn, But she said, "You name him." And so I thought of this moment, Gray's Peak, and I decided to name him Grayson. And this is Grayson and I. Turns 2 tomorrow, actually. Decided to name him Grayson to commemorate that when we as a family go through something difficult, a struggle, we experience our own brokenness or the brokenness of other people, that we will do whatever it takes, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how painful, we will lean in to address it as a desire to ultimately experience what we believe God has for us on the other side of whatever that is. And his name is a reminder of that every single day for us. I experienced what Worthington describes in his book, where he says this: when we're tortured by unforgiveness and are finally able to grant forgiveness, a transforming surprise occurs. Forgiving is like a flood of light at sunrise. Darkness has covered the sky, then the sun suddenly peaks over the horizon, illuminating giant clouds that stretch from the horizon to miles above it. Continues. Billowy clouds are lit with orange, red, and purple. The sky is afire with colors, such as the relief of forgiveness after wrestling with unforgiveness. That's my story. That's my journey. It's one of the most significant things in my life. In our time remaining, what I want to do is turn this around to you. And I want to ask you, as you think about those people, as you think about the ones who should have been your people, but they became those people because of what they said or did, are you wrestling with unforgiveness? Is there a measure of control that they have unknowingly over you because of what you're holding on to from what they did? My question and challenge for all of us in here is, what does it look like to forgive those people? I truly believe that better is available, that freedom is available, that forgiveness is available, but it's going to require you to go to the foot of the cross of Jesus in a way like you never have before. And to be reminded, and again, this is the number one thing I want all of us to walk out of here with, that forgiven people forgive those people. Your way forward is right here in your own forgiveness. I'm going to be honest in saying that today's message does nothing for you to enable you to forgive. It builds a foundation, a deeper why, but you have to do the work. You have to take the steps and step into that uncomfortable space and pursue a journey of forgiveness. The thing that's difficult with a message like this is we could do an entire series on this. But there's 3 very specific things that if you find yourself struggling with the question of what do I do with those people, what does it look like to forgive, there are just 3 very practical things that I want you to be able to write down or walk out of here with. And we've actually put resources on the What's Next page, which we talk about all the time. You can scan the QR code on the seat in front of you or just go to mpaustin.com/what's next and you can find these things. Number 1 is I just want you to decide to forgive and begin the journey. I want you to put it on your phone as an all-day event today, tomorrow, sometime this week, that you're saying, I'm deciding to cancel the debt, and I'm going to begin this journey of forgiveness. Number 2 is I would just encourage you to read the book. If you don't have the means of buying the book, again, the resource is there on that page. If you don't have the means of buying it, I will buy it for you. That's how passionate I am. Reach out to me on our staff page. I would love to do that because it changed my life, and I want it to be the same for you. And lastly, I would just encourage you to go to Overtime episode 38. We did it about a year and a half ago, where we just break down, there's a podcast we do, we break down the different steps of a decisional and emotional forgiveness. And finally, just tell a trusted friend, mentor, or counselor. If you don't have somebody in your life you can tell, reach out to our staff. We would love to meet with you. A topic like this is really difficult to just kind of end and all of us walk out and go to lunch and go pick up our kids. And so what we want to do to end our time is we just want to provide a moment for all of us to invite God in. Wherever you might be on your journey. Maybe you're in here and this is not relevant to you. Perhaps you haven't experienced a significant wounding. But maybe someday you might, or perhaps this is just a reminder for you of your own forgiveness at the cross of Jesus. Perhaps for you, you feel unforgiveness. You feel stuck, and you don't know what to do. I just want to provide an opportunity for you to go to the cross of Jesus in a way that you never have before and begin a journey, not just decide and cheapen it, but truly begin a journey to forgive and free yourself. Maybe you've been here and you've felt unforgiveness, and it's been so much of your story that you don't know how to break free. I just want to provide a space for you to invite God into that. We're going to sing a song. It's a couple decades old. Some of you might recognize it. But I just want this song to be something that is sung over you. You don't have to stand. You can sing if you want to. But this just to be an opportunity for you to take a step in the direction of forgiveness by taking a step in the direction of the cross of Jesus Christ, where your debt was canceled and where you are enabled to cancel somebody else's debt. And then I'll come back out here and wrap us up.
Savior, I come, quiet my soul. Remember, yeah, redemption sealed when your blood was spilled for my ransom. Everything I wanted, I count it all as lost. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, I belong to you. Lord, lead me to the cross. You were as I, tempted and tried. To your heart, to your heart, lead me to your heart, lead me to your heart, lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, I belong to you. Lord, lead me, oh, lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, I belong to you. Lord, lead me, oh, lead me to the cross.
Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we are just so thankful for the fact that you cancel our debt at the cross of Jesus. would you allow the truth of what that means, something that we might hear or understand in our mind once, but will take a lifetime to fully experience? Would you allow that to sink down a little deeper from our head to our heart today and lead us to a place where we can genuinely forgive as you have forgiven us? Father, would you illuminate the path forward for so many people who this is just the start of their journey and there are steps to be taken. There's a process to unfold. Would you be there with them and guide them and lead them in all of that? And Father, in just this entire series, the past few weeks, would you help us just view those people in our life the way you do? Understand that you love them and allow us to see them like that as well. Give all this to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you guys for being here. We'll see you next week.